All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a live Q&A with Michigan State University's Office of K-12 Outreach on activating family engagement and COVID relief funds. My name is Karen Meyer. I am the Federal Legislative Chair for the Michigan PTA. I'm on the Michigan PTA board, and I'm on the Advocacy Committee. I'm also the Northville Public Schools Council PTA's Advocacy Chair and the Northville High School PTSA Advocacy Chair.
Hi, I'm Nancy Jennings. I'm on the Michigan PTA Communications Committee. I am the Farmington Area PTA Council Vice President of Engagement, and I am the North Farmington High School PTSA Vice President.
With us today, we have two guest speakers from Michigan State University's Office of K-12 Outreach. Michigan State's Office of K-12 Outreach provides direct support to educators in Michigan and nationally. Keeping a relentless focus on student achievement, K-12 Outreach offers practical and policy advice to educators, legislative bodies, agencies, associations, and foundations. And you can find out more about them at education.msu.edu/K-12. Our first guest speaker today is Dr. Jacqueline Gardner. Dr. Gardner supports the data needs of Michigan schools and school districts. She focuses on navigating state of Michigan accountability requirements and student assessment data. She oversees data and evaluation projects for K-12 Outreach. Dr. Gardner also supports qualitative and quantitative research, practice, and policy initiatives. She has co-authored research articles published in nationally refereed journals and a book for the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. Dr. Gardner is also an Education Policy Fellowship Program alum. Tyler Thur is the co-coordinator for the Michigan Education Policy Fellowship Program. He's a passion about getting education data incorporated into the policymaking process, district level decisions, and school turnaround efforts. He holds a Master of Public Policy degree from Michigan State University and a bachelor's degree in international relations with minors in Jewish studies and science, technology, environment, and public policy from Michigan State University's James Madison College and Honors College. Just a little bit more about the Michigan PTA before we begin. The Michigan PTA was established in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1918. Since its start, Michigan PTA has been a leading voice in advocacy for children and families in Michigan. Michigan PTA promotes local, regional, and state efforts focused on the education and well-being of all children in our state. Michigan PTA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization associated with National PTA. You can find more about us on michiganpta.org and more about PTA in general at pta.org. This webinar is for informational purposes. If you have a question during this webinar, please enter it into the Q&A. If time allows, we will answer them during the webinar. Please include your email so that we may get back to you if we don't have time to answer them. We really do want to answer them. Your questions are important to us. So if we don't have time, please make sure that email is included, but hopefully we can get to that. So Nancy, if you'd like to ask the first question to Dr. Gardner, Mr. Thur.
Sure. What are COVID-19 relief funds, and why are they available to my district?
All right, so I'm going to take the first pass at this. And first, I want to thank Michigan PTA for expressing interest in this topic because it's incredibly timely and important. And understanding what they are and why they're available is the first step in understanding ESSER funds broadly. So just as a note, ESSER is kind of the overarching acronym that I'm going to maybe use and Tyler will use when referencing COVID relief money. Essentially what happened is when schools shut down and then went on to do virtual learning as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government quickly realized that schools and education in general was going to need a lot of support to overcome some of the not so great impacts that COVID-19 had on education and on student learning. So it was a great thing that the federal government did recognize that education was going to need a lot of financial resources to overcome some COVID-19 challenges. And what they did was they passed huge amounts of funding in 3 separate waves over the last year and a half to address any losses and any negative impacts related to the COVID-19 pandemic and those that continue to happen as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So those 3 waves, they have started to be allocated and distributed. The 3rd most recent wave that was passed earlier this fall was billions of dollars to Michigan, which is it's a huge deal, billions with a B there. That schools will be allocated very soon, and they will have to make decisions about how to spend that money. So they're available to all districts in the state of Michigan, and the amount that districts get does depend on the same formula as one funding. So it is tied to that formula, but every district does get COVID relief money. And if you think about that Michigan got billions of dollars to distribute to those districts, there are going to be districts that are seeing millions individually to spend some money on overcoming some of the negative effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on student learning.
Thank you. So how much funding will my district receive, and by when do they need to spend it?
Awesome. So I'll take this one. As Jacqueline said, thank you all so much for the invitation to be able to share some of this work. We're really excited that there's interested parties and are hoping to provide as much context and support for the process of spending these resources as we can. In short, a lot of money and in a relatively quick period of time. So more specifically, Jacqueline mentioned the general contours of what this funding looks like. Resources are going from the federal government to the state of Michigan to districts. To give it some context, Michigan from these 3 bills that Jacqueline referenced is going to get just under $5.8 billion. Of that, districts are going to get just under $5.2 billion, with that $600 million thereabouts going to the Michigan Department of Education to support state educational efforts. The National Conference of State Legislatures has a really cool ESSER fund tracker that we referenced in our paper, where folks can go through and see on a state-by-state basis how much money is going from the federal government to each state, and then how is that money being split between SEAs, state educational agencies, and localities, the districts that folks are really, really close to. As Jacqueline mentioned, that money is then going from the states to districts using Title I funding formulas. And from that, folks can look at the United States Department of Education's Education Stabilization Fund dashboard, which actually goes through district by district in Michigan, how much money has been allocated to be spent based on the 3 separate bills that Jacqueline referenced, to get a little bit of context in terms of how much money is spent. So in terms of timing, there are these 3 waves of funding that were introduced, and each one comes with its own deadline for when it needs to be obligated to be spent, where districts say, this is what we would like to use these resources for. For the first wave, the ESSER 1 funds, and again, we'll talk more in depth about what all these acronyms are, those have to be obligated by September 30th, 2022. The second wave by September 30th, 2023, and then the last wave by, you guessed it, September 30th, in this case though, 2024. In general, there's a lot of flexibility with these resources. I mean, this is an unprecedented level of spending. It's double what the federal government sort of put into the K-12 setting following the Great Recession in 2008. But there are some restrictions and timelines sort of in terms of those dates. And related to that is this potential fiscal cliff with these resources, right? So with that timeline being so short, the last wave in the end of September 2024, there's no guarantee of added financial fiscal stimulus from the federal government after that point, which frames a lot of this discussion in terms of a lot of resources now, but also a lot of uncertainty down the road.
Could you define some of the words we hear or read about surrounding COVID relief funds, such as ESSER, SEA, LEA, and stakeholder?
Yes, this is a very, very fair question. It's a little bit of alphabet soup going on. I feel like the education space always has a challenge with acronyms. And then when you bring in like government and funding, things really, really get stacked on top of one another. So Jacqueline did a good job sort of outlining where all of these resources come from. And that sort of provides some context on what is meant by ESSER. So Congress passed 3 bills from March 2020 to March 2021 to create an education stabilization fund. At the risk of more acronyms, that includes the CARES Act, which was in March 2020. That was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, going back to sort of the turmoil of March 2020 with hoarding toilet paper and first hearing about the virus and all sorts of stuff. In December 2020, towards the shift to the Biden administration, there was the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, the CARISA Act, which was another wave of money for the Education Stabilization Fund. And the largest one came in March 2021, so a year from that first stimulus, with the American Rescue Plan Act. And that was $122 billion for, among sort of centrally, the Education Stabilization Fund, but also other monies for coronavirus responses. That Education Stabilization Fund, as Jacqueline mentioned, tried to help education broadly conceptualized in response to the pandemic. It includes a governor's emergency education relief fund, which was money to support governor's offices with sort of implementing education reforms in response to COVID. It included a higher education emergency relief fund, sort of targeting universities like Michigan State, the University of Michigan, Western Michigan, so on and so forth. And then the last piece, and sort of what we're most focused on, is the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund. And that's the money that's specifically allocated to K-12 buildings, schools, districts, so on and so forth, to help respond to the learning loss and the effects of the COVID pandemic. ESSER, that elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund, gives money both to SEAs, state education agencies, here the Michigan Department of Education, and LEAs, local education agencies, which are who most folks, close to the Michigan PTA or education in general will deal with, right? Those are districts, those are schools, those are the folks providing on-the-ground education to students. The last piece in the definition, and where we sort of spent most of our time in working through our process guide for how districts might spend these resources, are stakeholders. These are the people that are connected to the education of students, who we think should have their voices heard in determining district needs and then best envisioned solutions for the struggles that students are going through because of COVID-19. Again, going back to our alphabet soup of laws, the last one, the ARP Act, the recovery plan, that was March 2021, tied to ESSER 3 funding, that third wave of federal stimulus, explicitly says that stakeholders include students, families, administrators, teachers, principals, school leaders, other educators, staff, and unions. So everyone sort of tied to the ecosystem. One thing we've been talking about in the Office of K-12 Outreach is how to broaden that definition of stakeholders even a little bit more to make sure that schools are responsive to community needs and that everyone with insight on the pandemic can sort of have a voice. So that can include community organizations. It can include advocacy groups and associations like Michigan PTA. It can include the business community that needs highly educated, strong students in order to thrive. And we believe it also can include higher education entities where students might eventually matriculate to continue their learning, and all of those universities' outreach branches. Folks like the Office of K-12 Outreach providing professional development and data analysis for districts in the area to get a sense of what's going on and also to sort of craft a path forward.
Thank you. As a stakeholder, do I need to be an education expert to be involved in this process?
This is an excellent question, and definitely something I want to make sure that the audience has a good understanding of. And I think Tyler did a good job of leading us into it. But the short answer is no. You absolutely do not have to be an education expert to be involved in this process. As Tyler mentioned, the government designed these ESSER 3 funds so that input from various different stakeholders was part of the process. And what that looks like is, once the funds are obligated, districts have 30 days to gather input from different stakeholders about how their plan is for spending these funds. If the community thinks they're being spent well, if they have other ideas, how the community thinks things will go with implementation. And this, you do not have to be an education expert. They want to hear from parents. They want to hear from business leaders. They want to hear from local universities. They want to hear from community organizations. So anyone that has a voice can be part of this feedback process for how to spend this big chunk of money. And this is a really important point, because in the education world and in districts, they're really focusing on educating our youth. So whether it's teaching them math and science and reading and writing, but they may not know how the students are behaving outside of school, or at home, or in, I don't know, Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts, whatever extracurricular they're doing that's not tied to their schools. They might not know what kind of needs the students have outside of education. And that's why it is so important for all stakeholders to have a voice and provide input about the plan for spending this large amount of money and about the implementation for spending this large amount of money. So we really want to encourage anyone who can hear this. You are part of a community, you are a stakeholder, and you are able to provide input as to how this money will be spent.
What can I do to be involved in the planning and implementation of this funding? And why is that important?
This is another really good question, and this one is a little bit more complicated. So one way to get involved is what might first come to mind: attend your local school board meetings, complete a survey that maybe gets sent out on behalf of the district if they're soliciting feedback from parents and from community members. Those are the two, I would say, most traditional and common ways of generating feedback about how money will be spent. However, we encourage anyone that can hear this, and we encourage districts to think outside of the box and solicit feedback and have support in other ways as well. This is going to be a challenge because of the limited human capital, or the limited people that districts have that will be able to collect this sort of information. So something that Tyler and myself and our boss, we've been thinking about is how to gather feedback or provide support to districts in unique ways. That would be, think about the skills that you have as an individual and how what you can do might be able to help with the planning and implementation of this funding. I know that everyone is really busy, especially during the holiday season, but this moment of funding is so high stakes that we really need all hands on deck. And given what we're seeing in the press about the teacher shortages, the educator shortages in general, it's going to take some parent volunteers, community volunteers, business volunteers to help support our districts so that this can be a positive process and so that the money can be spent as intended with positive outcomes. So perhaps you are an accountant and you could maybe help with crunching some of the numbers or looking at some of the numbers. Perhaps that's a way you could get involved, and you probably will generate some ideas as you're going along the way. Perhaps you're just a parent and you have a full-time job, but you see that your child at home has really struggled with their mental health since the pandemic. Reach out to your district. The districts may not reach out to you in the way that you are reachable, So we encourage parents, community members, business leaders to take it upon themselves to reach out to the districts. Yes, we are placing this not just on the shoulders of districts, but it's incredibly important. Perhaps you are a web designer, or you're really good at organizing things, and you could support your district in tracking their plans for how money is going to be spent. That's another way that might be supported, that you might be able to support the district. So my point here is, think outside of the box as to how you can get involved in planning and implementation of this funding. Trust me, just because the district isn't asking doesn't mean that they don't need the help. Districts are stretched so thin, and they also want to get this so right that they might be a little bit scared, but they need your support. And I'm sure they would welcome having some support around this process, because they're just as daunted by the great amount of funds that are coming in as other stakeholders in the area are. And this is important because we're going to kind of talk about it later, but this moment in education is very momentous because of the large amount of money that is going into education, and policymakers and other stakeholders, they want to see their money make a difference. And in order for their money to make a difference, planning and implementation has to go extremely well. And our concern is that districts might not have the support they need for planning and implementation. So I urge anyone who can hear this to try to support your district in any way that you can.
What are ways my school district might share information with me on how they're spending it?
Yeah, so this is another one of the district considerations that I think, is really heavily influenced by Jacqueline's note about limited bandwidth, shortage of teachers, shortage of administrators, so on and so forth. There are some required or de jure ways that districts must share with members of the public what's going on. Where I think potential lies is the de facto ways of accountability and the creative ways by which districts might be able to keep folks in the loop and ensure that everyone knows what's going on and how funded programs are contributing to community established success criteria or metrics of, knowing that funds were effectively used. So in terms of the required elements, the ARP Act, that third wave of ESSER funds, the American Recovery Plan, requires districts separately track ESSER expenditures and uses of these federal relief dollars, independent of how they're using normal state operational resources. So there is a very explicit fiscal piece for districts to sort of separate out how this money is being spent and keep track of internally the ways in which their budget is being impacted by ESSER funds. Second, and Jacqueline alluded to this as well in terms of sharing of public plans, there is a role, again, carved out in this legislation and state guidance and federal guidance around it to require, genuine public comment and engagement with the plans for how resources are going to be used. That could occur at community events like those that Michigan PTA hosts. It could occur at school board meetings where folks are sharing information, or it could sort of come on district websites with announcements of plans and very specific avenues with which how folks can sort of respond to those pieces. Where I think the interesting piece comes into play is how districts might creatively share information about how ESSER funds are being used, not just to check off some accountability block of, yep, we showed how the money is being used, we're providing some evidence it's being effectively mobilized, but how can we celebrate and publicize and show the strengths of these resources? I think that districts can consider using site visits and public events that highlight new programs, new capital expenses, new programs for folks to sort of see the effect of these resources. I think, as Jacqueline mentioned, there's a role for, really actively engaged parents and community members with PR or website design or communications knowledge to help the crafting of press releases or reports or white papers about where money is being used. I think there's a role for publicized tracking that we've seen on some district websites, but not all district websites quite yet, that models the websites I referenced from the US Department of Education with their Education Stabilization Fund dashboard and the National Conference of State Legislators tracking of ESSER funds to say, this is what the money went for. These are some positive effects of it. This is how you can interact with it. And I think there's, an opportunity for school board meetings to include almost, regularized communiques between district leaders and the public to say, this is what we're doing. This is how we're incorporating genuine public dialogue. And these are the effects that we're seeing. Because, as Jacqueline mentioned, it's central for folks to feel like they're being heard and they're being incorporated on the front end of decision making so that there's not resistance on the back end, and that so folks don't feel like the ultimate goals for their schools are being unmet in the face of this unprecedented federal support. The last thing I'll say, real quickly is, Michigan PTA has such an amazing history. I know back to 1918 as a bridge between communities and schools. And I wonder if there's a role for folks involved in the PTA to synthesize and take perspectives from teachers, from administrators that they interact with, and bring those sort of collectively to school boards and district leaders, and vice versa, to take the disparate experiences of family members and community members and students back to the school board, almost as like an intermediary between these different voices to sort of take advantage of the experience of community engagement and partnership to have a communication highway between both of these entities about what's going on with ESSER funds, how are they being used, how does that respond to public input, and why do we know that it will be an effective use of resources?
Thank you for that. Can you elaborate on how these funds can be spent?
So this is one of the big questions that everybody wants to know. This is so much money. What are we allowed to spend it on? And it's a very valid question because it is very daunting. Before I go into what you can spend it on, my first kind of disclaimer is districts should absolutely consult with their legal team just to make sure they're following the guidelines when spending money. So that's my disclaimer. Please check with legal teams before making any final decisions so that there aren't any issues down the road or, as Tyler was saying, like after the fact. With that said, ESSER funds can actually be spent on a lot of different things. The big point with ESSER funds is the district has to be able to tie it back to an outcome from the COVID-19 pandemic. So the money is supposed to reverse student learning loss that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, or provide additional supports that students might need as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And when schools and districts are thinking about what money might be spent on, you should really think, okay, what were the reasons that we had student learning loss in our district, in our schools because of the COVID-19 pandemic? And I'll just give a few really brief examples that the funding can be spent on. So say the buildings closed and students weren't able to return to in-person learning for quite a while because the air filtration system in the building was not very good. It was really old, 30 years old, needed to be replaced. Well, you can spend COVID-19 ESSER funding money on replacing the air filtration system because it's ultimately addressing fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. It will make it so students come back into the classroom. Another way that you can spend it is, say students are really struggling with their mental health, their social emotional needs as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Funds can be spent on mental health supports for both students and for teachers. So that's another way that they can be spent. Say that there are certain student groups that were more impacted than others, and we have seen this. You can use the money to specifically target those student groups that may need more support. Maybe it is students who are economically disadvantaged. Maybe it is students with disabilities. But if you can make a connection to, man, this is really because of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're having challenges, then you can spend the money on it. You can spend the money on professional development for teachers. Something that we've gotten a lot lately is, can we spend this money on things like hiring new teachers, teacher salaries, supports for teachers? So the answer to that is yes. And I just want to provide one caution. When spending COVID-19 money on things like teacher salary, think about how you'll be able to continue that sort of spending after these funds expire. So as Tyler mentioned, these funds do have an expiration date. They have to be spent by a certain date. And if you're going to invest in teacher salary, which 100% they deserve much more money than they're getting. But if you're going to invest it in teacher salary, make sure you're able to continue providing that support beyond 2024, when the last of the funds do expire. So that would be my one caution. And the same would be around hiring new staff. So hiring right now is really tough. I know that we're going to need more school counselors, more teachers. Just make sure that as the funds expire, you're still able to maintain those roles as needed. And some districts are thinking about trying to be proactive in developing like a student teacher pipeline program and using this money in that way. So as long as the district can link the money to something with the COVID-19 pandemic, which at this point, it's almost like what isn't linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So as long as you can link it to that, you should be able to spend this large amount of money on things related to that. And another note, there may have been things before the pandemic that were needed, and I'll just give you an example. So we already had a feeling that student social emotional needs and mental health was a little undersupported. I don't want to minimize it. It was undersupported before the pandemic, okay? And maybe districts didn't have the resources at that point to build supports in. Well, now they have this huge influx of money. There's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a severe impact on social emotional needs, mental health needs of both students and teachers. Now districts have the money, spend it on that, because it is even though it was a need beforehand, it is 100% tied to the needs now. So you might want to review page 12 of our paper, where we kind of outline many things that money can be spent on, but really it can be spent on a lot of different things. And I think that districts will be pleased with what they can spend it on versus having a lot of restrictions about what they cannot spend it on.
Can COVID relief funds be used with other funding sources, or could districts partner together?
So I definitely think there's room for creative funding of programs. There's definitely a little budget Tetris going on here in a way that I think can unlock some really creative approaches to supporting sustainable education interventions. So our office's model, and this is speaking a little bit more to like district leaders, but I think community members can encourage leaders to think this way, encourages districts to first and foremost do a broad community-driven needs assessment to say universally across the board, what do our students, educators, and community members need from our school? Where's their social emotional learning? Where's their academic achievement? Where is our ability to meet their basic needs? So on and so forth. From that, the hope is to identify effective strategies to respond to those needs and to finance those efforts, or at least as many of those efforts is allowable by some of the conditions that Jacqueline flagged with ESSER funds. There will still be unmet needs. This feels like a tidal wave of support, but it's in response to an ocean of challenges due to previous underfunding of education and systemic social challenges related to poverty, intergenerational trauma, discrimination, all sorts of systems that make learning in schools hard, independent of the effectiveness of schools and teachers and educational programs. So we're encouraging folks, for at least the first part of the question, to take advantage of this massive influx of federal support, but to think about how can they also mobilize using district options allowable under Proposal A to raise capital funds, much easier for certain districts than others, or grants from state and federal actors and state and federal departments of education to support specific programs, or even for some districts that have the opportunity to work with community foundations, where can private support and philanthropic money help meet any needs that aren't able to be addressed by ESSER funds, either because of some restrictions in those resources, certain timelines, or other challenges that require even broader investment. I'd say real quick too, this is an exciting moment. This fall, there was the first equalization of per pupil funding for schools since the passage of Proposal A, which raised the floor to a certain extent in terms of districts. And to the extent that folks are able to not replace or supplant current funding with ESSER funds, but to really build on that funding with ESSER funds, it's both required by law and it's an opportunity to sort of grow. In terms of the point about partnerships, it's something to consider. I don't know how much room there is for districts to pool resources and create common programs, in part because of the way funding's allocated based on Title I funding formulas, but I think there is a ton of room for districts to share best practices and ideas with each other to inform what they're doing, what programs they're seeking, and how they're engaging with community members.
I might just add on really quickly, sorry. Tyler, at the beginning of his answer to that last question, he mentioned a district's needs assessment. I just wanted to elaborate on this a little bit. We are encouraging all districts to undertake this needs assessment to truly determine what their needs are and also prioritize them so they can best plan for what the money should be directed at first and foremost. And the reason that we are suggesting this, this is just in general, doing a needs assessment when spending money, whether it's in education, whether it's in finance or business, it's something that is a good way to come up with a plan and execute the plan and do an evaluation. So it's just good for decision making. But in this particular case, it will help uncover some of the unique needs that districts have, as opposed to picking what might be the most popular or the most talked about initiative. And I say this because each district is going to need something absolutely different based off of their community, based off of their student population, based off of their teachers. And just because a neighboring district has elected to spend money on one thing doesn't mean it's the right fit for your district. So we really encourage districts to engage in that needs assessment, that you can bring community members in, stakeholders in, to help with implementation, prioritization, and also evaluation. And the evaluation part is just as important because we want to see impact after an initiative is decided on, and evaluating it will tell us if the impact or if the initiative is working and if it needs to be adjusted for future implementation down the road. So the needs assessment is really important, and the unique needs of each district are also extremely important because the districts are not alike across the state of Michigan.
Thank you for that. Can funding be used to address school safety or prevention of school violence?
This is another great question, and I'm sure it is on the minds of everybody nationwide, but specifically in Michigan, given the horrific events that we saw last week. And this is a question that Tyler and I wanted to make sure we had a good answer to, so we did a little bit of additional research on this. And the answer to this question is yes. ESSER funding can be used to address school safety or prevention of school violence. And let me tell you how that kind of works. First, again, my disclaimer, please seek legal advice before a district actually decides to spend money on an initiative like this. However, as I was mentioning in the previous question, ESSER funding is one of the main areas that they want ESSER funds to target would be student social, emotional, and mental health needs. And those can be tied directly back to ESSER funding and to the COVID-19 pandemic. So even if we have violence right now, there's a good chance that it might have been connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't fully understand the mental health toll it took on our youth and our teachers. And if we think that there is a connection to the students not having their socialization that they're used to, not being in a classroom, trying to learn on their own, then yes, we can use this money to invest in early detection programs, to provide training to teachers, to counselors, to do other things related to school safety and school violence, seek counseling for students, or maybe provide more support groups for students. Basically, I'm connecting this to mental health, and I'm thinking that ESSER funds can be used to really support mental health needs of students and teachers, which is hopefully tied to school safety and prevention of school violence. Now, some might be questioning whether or not these funds can be used for things like metal detectors. That is a little bit of a more gray area, mainly because tying it back to an outcome from the COVID-19 pandemic might be more challenging. But this is what I will say. I was kind of alluding to this earlier. School districts also have fundings from different pots of money. This ESSER funding is one pot of money. There may be things that districts have been spending other pots of money on that could be used through ESSER funding, or you could use ESSER funding for it, which would free up funds in other areas if you needed to spend money on something that wasn't allowable under ESSER. So I encourage districts, leaders, and community members to kind of think outside of the box. If there's something that a school needs and it can't be covered under ESSER funds, how can you use other funding to support that and shift other initiatives to the ESSER funding, because it can be tied to the COVID-19 pandemic? And the school violence piece, as a prevention of school violence and bolstering school safety, while some pieces definitely can be supported under ESSER, there may need to be a little bit of shifting in other areas as well.
Thank you. Our last question today from the Michigan PTA is that your process guide states that finally, the effectiveness of investments could be treated as a referendum on the value of the entire public education system. Could you please explain this further?
Yeah, absolutely. So in thinking through the significance of the piece, we paused and reflected on this line and similar ones like it, and sort of thought, is this too hyperbolic? Are we overstating the case? And the sort of resounding conclusion was no. The COVID pandemic upended how we as a society relate to just about everything. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I think close your eyes, think about February 2020, and think about what it would look like to say, tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up and everyone's going to be working from home, and grocery stores are going to have runs on supplies, and everyone is going to be learning remotely. And it's going to take months in many cases for us to return to some sort of new normal from the pandemic. Among the many contemporary debates sort of surrounding K-12 education, in my opinion, is what should traditional public education look like going forward? Is it a system that sort of takes what we've always done with, traditional models of public education defined by geographic boundaries? If you live in this community, you go to this school. Or does it include state support for parental choice via added state support of charter schools or new state support for private schools? And this is something that rhetoric is already going around, right? So in September, there was litigation filed in a federal district court to challenge the Blaine Amendment, preventing, in essence, public money going to private schools. The Michigan House and Senate in October passed legislation creating Michigan Opportunity Scholarships, sort of promoting school choice and private schools. It was vetoed by Governor Whitmer, but now there's push for a public referendum to get enough signatures to sort of put it into force. Just yesterday, Wednesday the 8th, for folks who are watching and recording, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments about a Maine tuition assistance program that excludes funding for religious schools and whether or not that's allowable. So I think you're seeing a lot of questions about what the structure of education should look like post-COVID, post-federal investment. Supporters of traditional public education are trying to make the case and win students back that it should operate in sort of the classic structure. Supporters of school choice are trying to do the exact same thing using evidence from the last 18 months. And I think a new data point, a new piece, fairly or unfairly, is going to be how do schools nationwide use the almost $200 billion of federal spending that has been allocated to them over the last year, stretching out to 2, 3, 4 years in terms of implementation. And is it meeting the needs of students? Is it responding to labor shortages in education? Is it responding to community-driven success criteria? How is it affecting test scores? How is it affecting social emotional learning? And I think that if we don't have, really clear conversations and goal setting exercises with community members and stakeholders about how they want to see these resources used, and how schools can meet the needs of students and continue through the pandemic that we're still in with a new variant and other challenges, that I think there are going to be folks that try and jettison or move past the current approach to education, and educators who question, their commitment to the institution itself. So we need to be extremely strategic about how we use this unprecedented moment of federal support. And we need to really genuinely engage community members, because this is a threat, but it's also an opportunity. There are school districts that are taking this moment and taking these funds to come up with new innovative programs that meet the desires of parents and educators and students, and are drawing students back into the fold from a period of privatization, from a period of shifts to alternate models of education. And I think the core question for us is, how do we systematize that and assure that it occurs for all schools, for all students across all of Michigan?
You've both given us so much great information today. Thank you again for that. We want to invite those that are watching to share questions in the Q&A that we can relay to the panelists and get them answered in real time. If you have any.
And I'll just say real quick, while folks are thinking of anything, I know y'all are willing to share our contact information too. We're more than happy to thought partner with folks to think about what implementation of some of this decision-making guide looks like and what community outreach looks like. We're really appreciative for the Michigan PTA for having us, and for more broadly the work that you all do around community engagement around ESSER funds and more broadly. And we're really excited about what future support could look like down the road.
Thank you so much. I certainly encourage everyone. I know we're asking in our district, what are the steps that the district is taking to engage families? Because as a part of ESSER, the community is supposed to be engaged. So it is beyond, it needs to be bigger than just administrative staff. And you can ask those questions yourself. So Karen, we do not have any questions in the Q&A.
Well, if anyone comes up with a question later, I hope that they feel free to contact the Michigan State University's Office of K-12 Outreach or the Michigan PTA. So just really want to thank our guest speakers today. That was wonderful information. Really appreciate you sharing your time and wisdom with us today. So appreciate that. And here is contact information in case anyone wants to reach out to Michigan State's Office of K-12 Outreach or Dr. Gardner or Mr. Thur. And then lastly, our contact information. If you want to reach out to the Michigan PTA, you can do that via our phone number or website, or Nancy or myself via our emails. So appreciate everyone's time, and it was very informative, and we continue to work towards making sure this money is well spent in our local districts. Everyone have a good afternoon. Thank you.